Palm Sunday has got to be one of the strangest Sundays to preach from home. Here I am standing in my house all alone, staring not at your smiling faces in the pews, but instead into a camera lens. And all of you are also at home with your families or all alone. Meanwhile, our story is about a city packed to bursting. Crowds of people rushing about, filling the streets with shouts of Hosanna. It's about a city stirred up, shaken up, as if by an earthquake, all because of one man riding in on a donkey. What is more, while we are wallowing in uncertainty and playing a lot of things by ear, the disciples are lucky enough to have explicit instructions from Jesus himself. Go into town. You'll definitely find a donkey and a colt there. You'll definitely be allowed to take them if you say they're for me. Bring them back. It's a weird to-do list, but a very clear one at least. I don't know about you, but I could really use a clear to-do list right now. Instead, we are all running around or sitting tight at home, trying to figure out how we can keep our families healthy, what we can do for our neighbors, how long this thing's gonna last, and the questions go on and on. Plenty of people of varying authority levels are offering up answers. To-do lists for individuals and cities and entire governments, plus their 2 cents about whose fault this is anyway. That's the point I want to focus on today. When bad things happen, it seems to be human nature to look for a cause. It was just a couple weeks ago that Kathy preached on the prime example of that perennial human search for a cause. Jesus and his disciples come across a blind man, and the disciples want to know who sinned that this man was born blind. To them, blindness is something wrong, and so there has to be someone to blame for that wrongness. The same kind of question is being asked today in regards to the pandemic, and fingers are getting pointed every which way. Because COVID-19 happened to originate in one little region in China, many blame China as a whole, i.e., the entire Chinese population and people of Chinese descent who don't even live there. Then there are the people who always crop up in times of crisis. Those who claim that God is punishing humanity for the gays. For others of us, the reason for coronavirus is humanity's crimes against nature. Have you seen all those memes shared on social media proclaiming that we were the real virus all along? Mother Nature is clearing us out. You can tell by the decreases in pollution in cities under quarantine. Never mind that those most severely impacted by COVID-19 are those least responsible for pollution. Chinese villagers, Asian Americans, the LGBT community, humanity in general, these are easy targets on which to release our fear and uncertainty, either because they're too far away or too abstract to resist the blame, or because they're groups that are minoritized, too vulnerable and small to fight back effectively. We are hurting, and we want to know why. People we love are in danger, and we want to fight back against that danger. And when we lash out, when overwhelmed with pain and fear, we might just mistake our fellow sufferers for our enemies. I see a similar thing happening in the gospel narratives that we read in Holy Week, starting with today's Palm Sunday reading. That perennial human need to find someone to blame when we are in pain has borne bad fruit throughout Christian history. From the start, Christians have used Holy Week as a time to retell the story of Jesus' triumphant march into Jerusalem, cheered on by his people who, within a week, reject him, hand him over to the Romans to be ridiculed, tortured, and crucified. And even though it is the Roman Empire that holds the real power in Jesus' world, even though it is the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, who chooses to protect his public image over releasing Jesus, even though the Romans are the ones who do the ridiculing, the torturing, and the crucifixion. Christians across many times and places have concluded that Jesus' brutal death is the fault of the Jews. And not just the Jews who were alive in Jesus' time and place, but somehow we extend the blame to every single Jewish person across history. We hear the tale of Jesus, a kind, justice lover whom we worship as God, unjustly executed, and we ache. We are pained to know his pain, and that compassion is a beautiful thing. The question of why an innocent person like Jesus would ever be treated in this way is a good question, but not when it leads us to the wrong conclusions. Not when, instead of looking up at the people who actually hold the power, actually hold innocent lives in their hands and choose power and profit over people, but we instead look down at those suffering with us, or perhaps even suffering more than us. We blame the Jews because they're a vulnerable group, small and scattered, with ways that are strange to us. We blame China because we can sink our fists into the person on the street who looks Chinese to us. We have a harder time attacking our government representatives who worry more about stock market values than about those who stock grocery store shelves. It is easier to blame the Jews, the gays, the Chinese, than it is to blame seemingly unconquerable powers. And hey, I know that I am preaching to the choir here. I know that the members of Grace Presbyterian Church are calling out the rise of anti-Asian hate crimes, are contacting government representatives, and are finding concrete ways to help their neighbors in this time of crisis. I am grateful to be part of this church for that very reason. Thank you. Keep on going. But I do think that noticing this human desire for a cause for suffering and being aware of that need's role in the hateful responses to this pandemic can help us enter into conversation with friends, families, coworkers, and others who don't see the same way. If we can muster up a little compassion for them, hard as that can be when they keep on posting anti-Asian memes or ranting about how if we stopped worrying about the old and disabled, we could all just get back to our lives, they might be open to listening to us and eventually changing. Maybe we can add to the crowd of those who are taking action against the violence and the hoarding, the racism and the ableism. And maybe that's just me being too optimistic. But I think it's worth a try. If anyone can persuade a person who has swallowed hateful rhetoric without seeing it for the poison it is, it's got to be the one who takes the time to hear them out, who doesn't just yell a reactionary comment across the void of social media, but instead asks if they want to have a real conversation. Maybe we can help people around us raise their gazes from the folks who are being trampled in the mud beside them and instead look up at the ones with the real power to make changes we need. To me, that is what Jesus is doing in this strange little text, this strange little parade into Jerusalem. He's doing what so many of the prophets in his holy texts did before him. He's acting out a story that speaks truth to power and to the powerless. How so? Well, let's imagine ourselves back into the 1st century CE. Passover is just around the corner, and faithful Jews from across the known world are flocking to Jerusalem. The city is filling up with people who are eager to celebrate their ancestors' liberation from Egypt. But these faithful Jews are not the only ones making their way to Jerusalem. Their current oppressor, the Roman Empire, knows the threat that the Passover story holds for those in power. And it is sending reinforcements to ensure that the story of past oppressors overthrown won't lead to an uprising now. Jerusalem is overflowing with excitement and expectation, but also with tension, as these soldiers march in, and at their head is the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. From the west, Pilate and his troops march into the city, showing off their military strength and their war horses to remind any Jewish upstarts in the crowd that it would be foolish to resist the Roman Empire's might. From the east, Jesus kicks off a different parade. A parade of one travel-wearied man, riding not a war horse but a donkey, attended by the lowliest of his people, the impoverished and the healed sick, maligned women and homeless followers, who usher him in with cries of, "Hosanna! Save us!" In our Holy Week readings, the Gospel writers focus on Jewish reactions to Jesus' parade. But I am much more interested in Rome's reaction. Because while Matthew's Gospel describes how the Jewish leaders get real ticked off by Jesus' little stunt, I wonder if Jesus really put on this parade to get Rome's attention. I don't imagine that these Romans would have recognized all the prophetic symbolism in Jesus' entrance, but they hear these Jewish voices crying out, "Hosanna, save us," and calling to the Son of David, an old Israelite king, and they know enough to recognize the threat that Jesus poses to the powers that be. Today's reading tells us that when Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was shaken up, with everyone asking, "Who is this guy?" If this little crowd were to manage to shake up the thousands of people who have traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate their ancient liberation, Rome just might have a riot on its hands. They better nip this in the bud. Better take care of this upstart Jesus now, before they lose control of the situation. In our sorrow-driven search to know why our beloved Jesus had to die, we often point to the Jews who handed him over to Pontius Pilate. But in the end, those Jewish leaders didn't have much more power than Jesus himself did. They lived under Roman occupation too. It was Pontius Pilate who truly held Jesus' life in his hands. And, as I said earlier, Pontius Pilate chooses his own reputation, politics, and power over human life. Likewise, we can blame just about anyone for the pandemic. But in the end, it's our political leaders who hold the power for real, effective measures that can help end this thing as soon as possible with as few deaths as possible. Instead, many of these politicians are saying that 200,000 deaths wouldn't be so bad, and are more interested in protecting stockholders and landlords than the hospital workers and the newly unemployed. My friends at Grace Presbyterian, I know that most, if not all of you, already know this. Still, I imagine that many of you, like me, have plenty of friends and family and peers who have yet to realize that politicians who favor power over people will never be their friends. It is our unenviable task to be the crowd that shakes them up, to be the one who doesn't just sigh deeply and scroll past anti-Asian posts, but reaches out privately to the one who made it and say, "Hey, it sounds like you're experiencing fear right now, just like I am." And then, once a conversation has gotten going, continue with, "I know you're coming from a place of hurt, but you are pointing fingers at the wrong people." It's not a fun task. Reaching out like that can get us into arguments with people we would rather not fight. We face anger and rejection, and we have to use up valuable time and energy to cultivate a true conversation like that. I understand that some of us just don't have that time and energy, but those of us who do should. And I'm speaking to myself here too. I bet you also know lots of people who have simply shut down, who are too shaken up by everything that's happening right now to do anything. And so they're doing nothing at all. They might appreciate an invitation to join the crowd that's making emergency food bags for Grace's food pantry, or for some help in calling their government officials, or just a phone call where you can vent together and grow close, even in this time of self-quarantine. While we don't have that much power, that much control over the situation, God does empower us to do something. And we have each other. We are holding on to each other through live streamed videos and telephone calls, groceries dropped off, and prayers shared. Queer Chinese-Australian writer and organizer Mimi Zhu puts it this way: we will learn to kiss and hold each other through the waves of the web. We will feed each other, redistribute wealth, strike. We will understand our own importance from the places we must stay. Communion moves beyond walls. We can still be together. My friends, even in our separate homes, occupied with questions and fears, we are marching together in one crowd, a community that reaches past walls, past pointed fingers, past despair, and into compassion and action. And I thank God for that.